Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harry Froklage, and I am the Director of Development and Graduate Affairs here at St. Jerome's University. I stand before you tonight with both of those hats, Development and Graduate Affairs, scrunched figuratively but firmly down upon my head. While it is true that this is a public lecture, you should know that my colleagues, Sarah Daly and Rhonda Flewelling, and I organized this event as an expression of thanks to the many generous donors who contributed to St. Jerome's this past year. Hence, the development hat. Our donors are the people who make possible the scholarships and bursaries, academic and chaplaincy programs, and public lectures that enable St. Jerome's to be the special place that it is, and we are enormously grateful for their support. I'm also sporting my Graduate Affairs hat because it is my privilege this evening to introduce to you a member of a very select, a very exalted, a very rarefied group. Dan Bortolotti is a St. Jerome's graduate. Moreover, he is among that even smaller and more privileged group that had the good sense to meet their future spouses while living here in residence. We are pleased to welcome his wife, Wendy, back to St. Jerome's as well. Since graduating from St. Jerome's in 1992 with a degree in English, Dan has successfully pursued a career in the competitive and challenging world of freelance writing. He has been an editor with Equinox and Today's Parent and has contributed to Money Sense and Maclean's on a dizzying array of topics, from baseball card economics to the 10 Commandments of homework. He writes a monthly column for Chatelaine called Homefront, in which he explores with comic thoughtfulness the issues facing the contemporary father and husband. Finally, he is the author of 4 books, the most recent of which has garnered him great recognition and success. It is called Hope in Hell: Inside the World of Doctors Without Borders. It is on this topic that we've invited him to speak to us this evening, a topic that could not possibly be more timely. Let me just note now that Dan has agreed to answer questions following his formal presentation, and that copies of Hope in Hell, along with his other books, are available for sale in the lobby from Wordsworth Books, copies that Dan has agreed to sign following his talk. All of us have witnessed the casualties of Middle East conflict over the past year, and more recently the tragic victims of the catastrophic tsunami in the Indian Ocean and South Pacific. The phenomenon of humanitarian aid is of enormous interest at this time, and the organization known as Doctors Without Borders, or more properly Médecins Sans Frontières, has won renown for its determinedly neutral delivery of necessary medical interventions in circumstances that are fraught with politics and factionalism. Ladies and gentlemen, to give us a clearer understanding of the work undertaken and challenges faced by Doctors Without Borders, please welcome Dan Bortolini.
Thanks very much, Harry, and thanks to everyone for coming out tonight. As Harry mentioned, this is a bit of a homecoming for me. I spent 4 great years here in the early 17th century, or at least it felt like that walking around campus today, because so much has changed since I was here. But a lot of things haven't changed as well, including a lot of familiar faces that it was great to see again. What I'd like to do for you tonight is I've prepared a 2-part presentation based on the research and the field visits I did while writing my book, Hope in Hell. The book is a profile, as Harry mentioned, of Médecins Sans Frontières, probably the most respected humanitarian aid agency in the world. In the first part of the presentation, I'd like to read an excerpt from the first chapter, which in the book functions as an introduction to the work of Médecins Sans Frontières. It's a profile of a medical project in rural Angola, which I visited in June 2003. And I put together some photos that I took there as well to accompany the text, so I hope that will add a little added dimension for those of you who may have already read it or who might read it later. And after that, I would like to talk a little bit about what has become the most or the greatest threat to international aid in recent years, and that is the blurring of the line between humanitarian action and military action. Humanitarian action must remain neutral. Military action, by definition, is never neutral And when that distinction is lost, aid workers are put in danger in the field. And we've all heard about incidents in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places where aid workers have been targeted in recent years. I'd like to try to give you an idea of some of the reasons for that, to provide some context for that. So as I said, I'll begin with a reading. This is from the first chapter of the book. It's called Under the Angolan Sun. Dr. James Knox slings his medical kit across his back and begins the 10-minute walk to the tiny health center in Quimba. Along the main road in this northern Angolan village, children playing in front of adobe houses greet him with cries of mundele, the Kikongo word for white person. Just past the market, the health center comes into view on the left. When the electricity is working, the 10 or so beds in the inpatient ward are illuminated by a solitary light bulb. Today, they're lit only by the afternoon sun, which enters along with the flies and the malaria-toting mosquitoes through the ward's 2 glassless windows. A mild breeze struggles heroically to vanquish the smell of unwashed bodies as Knox sits down on an empty bed to get a closer look at a newborn baby who was admitted for malnutrition a few days earlier. The mother, who can't be older than 18, was having difficulty breastfeeding, so she walked for 2 days from the town of Serra da Canda, more than 30 miles to the southeast. She looks relieved as the doctor explains in Portuguese that the baby is gaining weight and is now out of danger. Tall and slender, with black hair and expressive eyes, the 28-year-old physician says it's hard to know just what he'd be doing had he decided to practice in his native Australia, probably holding down a junior hospital position. But here, 2 weeks into his first mission with Médecins Sans Frontières, he's the only show in town. As a volunteer, Knox will spend 9 months giving health care to the 25,000 people who are expected to pass through Quimba on their way home from the Democratic Republic of Congo. During the most recent outbreak of war, 70,000 Angolans fled to the Congo. The border is just 18 miles to the north. But now that peace has endured for more than a year, many of these refugees are trickling back and trying to rebuild their lives. As he makes his rounds, Knox is watched by a brother and sister, perhaps 4 and 5 years old, who smile at him while they munch BP5 biscuits, high-energy supplements given to moderately malnourished children. These kids, their father explained, have just returned from the Congo, and they've found that good food is scarce. They'd been subsisting mainly on funge, a gelatinous porridge made from cassava flour. It fills the belly but is devoid of protein. When the little girl arrived, she also had a fever, a red flag for malaria, which is rampant in Quimba. With the closest lab a 3-hour drive away, Knox has to rely on a rapid blood test called Paracheck. The test isn't 100% effective, so when it turned out negative, he chose to treat her for malaria anyway. It's not the kind of decision that he would have had to make at home. In a Western hospital, diagnosis is often made with a battery of sophisticated instruments. Here, the technology at Knox's disposal fits into his shoulder bag: stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, thermometer, otoscope, and a copy of MSF's Essential Drugs Manual. Late in the afternoon, a young man arrives with his gravely ill sister after a bicycle journey of more than 40 miles. Johanna, 27, is lethargic and emaciated. Her brother says that she had a cough for about 2 weeks, but after his examination, Knox expects she's been ill for much longer. Her hip bones protrude sharply, her rib cage is clearly visible, her skin barely springs back when pinched. When a nurse asks her to sit up, she vomits. Knox gets her started on oral rehydration salts, but he fears that dehydration is only the beginning of her worries. Several old women shuffle around outside the ward, one wearing a T-shirt improbably emblazoned with the words "Extreme Hockey." It's late in the afternoon now, and while the temperature is still well over 70 degrees, 2 of them ask for blankets and perhaps a bit of food, but the health center has nothing to spare. MSF's main activity in Quimba is supporting the health center. Working with the local Ministry of Health, the agency supplies drugs and equipment, transports seriously ill patients to the larger hospital in the provincial capital of Mbanza, Congo, and trains the all-male nursing team. Though he examines some of the patients himself, James Knox spends the bulk of his time supervising the work of the local nurses and giving informal presentations in the Jangu, a gazebo-style shelter built outside the hospital from sticks and thatch. He knows that MSF can't change things overnight, but he's doing his best to make sure that the clinic follows some minimum standards. It's difficult, he says, because there are few nurses who have even an idea what infection control is. When we got here, there was no place for me to wash my hands. I had to go to the pump outside the health center. And there was no way to dispose of sharps. They were just going into the rubbish bin with everything else. We heard that before our arrival, needles were sometimes reused on the same patient. MSF has dug a disposal area behind the health center where sharps are destroyed before they become children's playthings. Knox has a mental list of other priorities. At the moment, I insist that the nurses give the correct dose of the correct drug in a way that's safe for the patient. I don't yet insist that they wear gloves for all procedures. That will come later. Sipping a warm beer outside the rented MSF staff house, James Knox reflects on his first mission. Like most doctors who volunteer with the organization, he knows that some people look on his work as heroic, as though he had selflessly sacrificed his career and put his life on the line to help the poor and suffering. The reality is hardly that simple. There probably are people who do this for purely altruistic reasons, he says, but I haven't met one yet. I mean, you're helping people, but it's not exactly altruistic if there's something in it for you as well. Admittedly, delivering humanitarian aid can be dangerous in Angola. MSF has a few rules that suggest the potential risks, even in peacetime Quimba. No overnight stays without a vehicle and a driver on standby. No walking alone in the village after dark. Always carry $50 security money in case of extortion or kidnapping. Everyone also gets mine awareness training. If you're driving, follow the tracks of the other vehicles and never leave the main road. If you must stop to relieve yourself during a long drive, do it behind the car. Of course, following these security rules is hardly a guarantee. On November 29, 2002, two MSF vehicles were returning from a small village where they had spent the day giving measles vaccinations. They had driven the same road that morning, but this time the back wheel of the first Land Cruiser, jam-packed with 13 people, hit an anti-tank mine. 7 people were killed, 4 Angolan MSF staffers, 2 Ministry of Health employees, and a baby boy. The dangers of road travel in Angola can be even more unpredictable. MSF's policy in most African countries is clear. If you hit a person or an animal with a vehicle, you keep driving, returning only once you've notified the authorities. You don't stop to help, even if you're a doctor. It sounds cold-hearted, but an incident on March 9, 2003 showed why it's necessary. Rachel Stowe, a British physician with MSF, was on the road with driver Aderito Augusto and an assistant when the vehicle struck and killed a young girl. When they stopped, a mob dragged Augusto from the driver's seat and brutally beat him to death. Stowe narrowly managed to escape in the Land Cruiser while the assistant fled on foot. But tonight, as Knox speaks, a full moon high in the southeast casts its sheen on the sleepy village of Quimba, and it's easy to feel far removed from these horror stories. Next day at the health center, another baby arrives with signs of malaria, and a paracheck comes up positive. As the nurses prepare an infusion of quinine, Knox notices that the bottle contains far more medication than necessary. The nurses are planning to stop the drip once the right amount is delivered and then use the same bottle for the next dose. Knox has to insist that they find a clean, empty bottle to put the excess in. Otherwise, if no one remembers to check it at the right time, the child could get an overdose. The baby shrieks as the IV needle is inserted and then removed when the nurse sees that he's missed the vein. 3 or 4 more attempts are unsuccessful, not surprisingly, since this procedure is difficult at the best of times, and it's even harder if the patient is dehydrated. The baby's mother sits off to the side in silence, but she's clearly distressed at watching her child suffer. After a few minutes, she walks out of the ward. Knox stands by and calmly offers advice, refusing to take over from the nurses and undermine their training. It takes half an hour to get the line into place. Then, with the drip finally established, one of the nurses picks up the IV stand and attempts to move it to the other side of the bed. In the process, he yanks the needle out of the baby's arm, and they have to start over again. At one point, 5 nurses are working on the baby, who by this time is as stoical as the good doctor. Soon the needle is in place again, but hours later the child's arm is filled with fluid. The needle wasn't in a vein after all. Early the next day, Knox decides to transfer another sick baby along with Johanna to the provincial hospital in Mbanza, Congo. He'll make the trip too. It's only about 40 miles, but the drive takes 3 hours as the Land Cruiser negotiates enormous ruts and water-filled craters, challenging the passengers to keep their heads from smashing against the roof. At one point, the driver struggles for a minute or two in mud that must be a couple of feet deep, and this is the dry season. Later on, the vehicle passes the carcasses of a blue pickup truck and a burned-out tank, both reminders that this road used to be mined. Inside the car, Johanna, wearing a mask to protect the others and accompanied by a female relative, lies across one of the bench seats. The baby girl in the arms of her father looks ashen and occasionally gasps for breath. Knox gestures for a cup of water, which they try to get into the baby's mouth. She quickly spits up. Few words are exchanged during the trip, even between the Kikongo speakers. It's mid-afternoon when the car pulls up at the hospital in Mbanza, Congo. The baby and her parents quickly disappear inside as the staff carry in Johanna. Nearby, a smiling young man rides a specially designed tricycle that he pedals with his hands. His legs, withered by polio, hang limply from the seat. Knox will return the following morning to check on the new arrivals, but then it's back to Quimba where he's needed more. The doctors in Mbanza, Congo will take over the care of his patients, and following up isn't always possible. He never does learn their fate. Thanks. I'm just going to... So, excuse me. The Angolan project that we just visited is but one of hundreds of MSF projects in some 80 countries around the world. And delivering humanitarian aid in these places has always been inherently dangerous. As we've seen in Angola, those risks might come from landmines or angry mobs. Other aid workers may fall victim to malaria, traffic accidents, or stray bullets. But these are occupational hazards that volunteers are prepared to accept. What they're far less willing to accept is the trend whereby aid workers are targeted specifically. Last June, 5 MSF workers traveling in a clearly marked Land Cruiser in Afghanistan were stopped by armed Taliban, informed that they were pawns of the American military, and shot dead. Several months later, in Iraq, Margaret Hassan, head of the aid agency CARE International, was abducted and executed by extremists. Isolated killings of aid workers for various reasons have existed for decades, but in recent years, aid workers have been singled out, and the immunity that they once enjoyed is no longer something they can take for granted. Just why are aid workers facing greater danger than ever before? Is it because radical groups in places like Afghanistan and Iraq no longer have any respect for the neutrality of humanitarian groups, something that was once considered a universal tenet? That's certainly part of the problem, but extremists are not the only culprit. Many aid workers on the ground argue that Western governments must also share the blame. And they must share the blame because they blur the line, often intentionally, between humanitarian and military interventions. What do I mean by this? Well, when the world's great powers position a politically motivated war as being about values and not interests, as NATO did in Kosovo in 1999, or when U.S. aircraft dropped food packages along with bombs, as they did in Afghanistan in 2001. And when British Prime Minister Tony Blair speaks of the invasion of Iraq as having a humanitarian dimension, and when aid groups accept contracts from belligerent nations in these conflicts, all of these activities threaten the neutrality of humanitarianism, and by doing so, they paint targets on the back of aid workers. Finally, and I don't want to blame the victims here, but aid agencies must also be aware of how their well-intentioned actions can allow that line to be blurred and how they can compromise their own neutrality. This evening I'd like to make a fairly subtle and perhaps even controversial argument. It's one that is important not only for governments and humanitarian aid workers to understand, but for the journalists who report on international issues, and for you and me and everyone else who sees and reads those reports and gives money to aid agencies. And the kernel of the argument is this, that however we may feel about military interventions like those in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq, we must be careful not to let governments pass them off as humanitarian, when in fact they are political. That is not to say that war is never just or never necessary, only that it is never humanitarian. Humanitarianism is concerned only with putting an end to suffering. As I write in my book, it is not for humanitarians to ask who is right in a war, but only who needs help. Peace is not their business, even if it is their desire. It might help to make an analogy here. If you imagine a physician who's working in a penitentiary, every day she may be delivering medical care to murderers, rapists, child molesters. But it is not her role to decide whether those murderers are worthy of medical care. As a humanitarian, she must concentrate only on alleviating their suffering. Now, that is not to say that those murderers, rapists, and child molesters should not be judged at all. Indeed, they must be, but they must be judged by the courts and not by doctors. In the same way, humanitarian agencies must leave the political solutions to governments and confine their activities to meeting the needs of vulnerable populations. It's a popular misconception, I think, that humanitarians are pacifists. Certainly, like any Miss Universe contestant, they may wish for world peace, but they must be careful not to take public positions about specific wars, either for or against. It is not appropriate for a humanitarian organization to say that the U.S. should not have invaded Iraq, any more than it would be appropriate for them to call for military intervention in Darfur. Individual humanitarians can hold whatever private opinions they wish, but organizations in the field do not have the luxury of broadcasting those opinions. If they do, they are no longer neutral, and humanitarians must remain neutral if they operate in a war zone. Over the last century and a half, neutrality, the principle of not taking sides in a conflict, has variously been held up as an ideal and denigrated as a useless relic. The idea is not new, of course, but for a long time it was confined to one group or another agreeing to stay out of some specific conflict between its neighbors. That all changed in 1859 when a Swiss businessman named Henri Dunant was traveling in northern Italy and almost literally stumbled onto the Battle of Solferino, which was being fought between Napoleon III and Austrian troops. The bloodbath that he witnessed so horrified him that when he returned to Switzerland, Dunant spearheaded what became the First Geneva Convention, an international agreement to provide protection for those who tended the wounded on battlefields. To act as a guardian of this agreement, Dunant and his colleagues created a new organization. Today, that group, the International Committee of the Red Cross, is recognized by just about every nation on earth as the steward of the Geneva Conventions and of all international humanitarian law. In return for the privileged position it has been given to act as an intermediary in conflicts and to get access to prisoners of war, for example, the Red Cross agrees that it cannot ever take sides. Now, I think you can all see that this position is problematic. The Red Cross was well aware of what went on in Nazi death camps, for example, and yet it did not speak out against them. And in an era of Hitler and Stalin, whatever theoretical value there might have been in the concept of neutrality, it was increasingly hard to see it as anything other than the silent acceptance of tyranny and genocide. As one French intellectual put it at the time, the ethics of the Red Cross are solely valid in a world where violence against mankind comes only from eruptions, floods, crickets, or rats, and not men. I should point out that in 1948 there was a UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, which does make it part of international humanitarian law that gives states the right, not only the right, but the obligation to intervene in cases where genocide is believed to be occurring. However, the words of that French intellectual and the frustration with neutrality pretty much sums up the intellectual climate of, at least in France, by the late 1960s and the early 1970s, and that culture had a profound influence on the people who founded Médecins Sans Frontières. In 1968, a group of French doctors flew to Biafra, a breakaway state of Nigeria that was fighting a civil war with the government forces there, and they attempted to bring medical care to tens of thousands of civilians. Biafra, by the way, was the first famine ever to be televised. And so it had a lot of resonance with the general public in Europe and in North America. And when these doctors entered the country under the auspices of the Red Cross, though, they had to sign agreements promising neutrality and discretion. But when they got there and they began treating these terribly malnourished children, the French doctors soon came to see that the Biafran civilians were not simply caught in the crossfire of a war, they were being deliberately starved by the Nigerian forces who had set up a food blockade. The doctors believed that they were witnessing a genocide. So when they returned to France, some of these doctors denounced the Nigerian government, a move that was clearly a violation of their Red Cross agreement. Disillusioned, they created Médecins Sans Frontières in 1971, a group devoted not only to delivering medical aid in conflict zones and natural disasters, but to speaking out against the inhumanity that it witnessed in the field. Neutrality was and still is enshrined in its charter, but MSF has always pushed its limits when it has felt that it could not remain silent. In the rare cases where it has denounced a regime, as it recently did in North Korea, for example, its doctors are either expelled from the country or they withdraw voluntarily. Its philosophy has been called rebellious humanitarianism, and it appeals to many people in the West who look at the UN and sometimes even the Red Cross as dithering organizations more concerned with building consensus than in doing what is right. Now, this is a great story, the triumph of a scrappy group of rebels over bloated and spineless bureaucrats. And that's certainly the way it was portrayed by many commentators when MSF was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1999. Except it's not really accurate. The Nobel Committee remarked at the time of its presentation of the award that MSF upheld the idea that, quote, national boundaries and political circumstances or sympathies must have no influence on who is to receive humanitarian help. Now, this is true, and this referred to MSF's insistence on the right of independent civil humanitarian aid groups to have access to the victims of war. But many people at the time understood this as something quite different. They understood it instead they saw the Nobel Prize as giving sanction to the then current idea that it is legally and morally acceptable for states to intervene in the affairs of other states if they believe that gross violations of human rights are occurring. Now, these are two very different things, and the distinction is very important. The former, the right of humanitarian aid organizations to get access to victims in war, is enshrined in international humanitarian law. The latter, the right of states to do the same thing, is not only not enshrined in law, but it is usually an excuse for strong countries to invade weaker ones in order to overthrow their leaders and install more cooperative ones. We need a little context here, to understand why that misconception occurred. When MSF received the Nobel Prize in 1999, it was only months after the NATO military intervention in Kosovo. Ostensibly, the objective of this bombing campaign was to stop Serbian aggression and protect ethnic Albanians in that region. Now, whether or not this was morally defensible, the point is the campaign was waged on false pretenses. Instead of calling it what it was, a military intervention to achieve a political goal, namely the toppling of Slobodan Milosevic, NATO portrayed it as a humanitarian intervention, insisting that they were dropping bombs as part of a mission to rescue the Albanian Kosovars. This war even gave us the perverse term humanitarian bombing. And it was the first time since World War II that the rhetoric of humanitarianism was used to justify a war. Now, I'm not arguing that the NATO intervention in Kosovo was wrong. Certainly it forced a tyrant from power, and indeed many believe that had NATO intervened several years earlier, a brutal war in Bosnia might have been averted. The point is that even if a military intervention has some positive outcomes, like the removal of Milosevic or the Taliban or Saddam Hussein, that does not mean that it is a humanitarian intervention. Now, this isn't just semantics. There's a reason why governments co-opt humanitarian rhetoric to justify their actions. Humanitarianism is above reproach. Political action is never above reproach. One can make an argument for a just war, but a just war is not a humanitarian act. As the journalist David Reef puts it, and I should point out that Reef supported the interventions in both Kosovo and Afghanistan, Using the moral warrant of humanitarianism puts war beyond debate, and war should never be beyond debate. When you dress up military action as a humanitarian act, he writes, all dissent from the war is stifled because the humanitarian imperative is held to trump all other considerations. For its part, MSF refused to judge NATO's actions. We're not going to say if the bombing should go on or stop, if there should be a land war or a truce, said its international president, who happens to be a Canadian doctor named James Orbinski. That's up to governments. We're simply calling upon them to live up to their obligations. Now, this is a position that angered many critics because it seems so austere and it seems so convenient. Yet MSF is experienced enough to know that the concept of humanitarian military intervention is not only contradictory, but dangerous. And indeed, by the time the U.S. attacked Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003, the consequences of blurring the lines between military and humanitarian intervention had become even more dire. Let's start with Afghanistan. When the U.S. launched its campaign there against the Taliban in October of 2001, it immediately began dropping food and medical packages as well as bombs. These supplies were hopelessly inadequate to address the problems of civilians, but they were an effective propaganda tool. They were an effective part of a strategy to win the hearts and minds of Afghans, while here at home in North America, the public and the media felt comforted by the assumption that Afghan civilians were not suffering, even though literally millions of them would eventually be displaced from their homes during the fighting. That same month, Secretary of State Colin Powell explained in a speech that governments, and I quote, must work in partnership with aid groups if compelling problems are to be effectively addressed. As I speak, just as surely as our diplomats and military, American NGOs are out there serving and sacrificing on the front lines of freedom. He called aid groups force multipliers and an important part of our combat team. Later, the military distributed pamphlets suggesting that in order to receive aid, civilians would be required to provide intelligence. MSF even accused the U.S. of having military people on the ground in Afghanistan dressed in T-shirts and driving around in white Land Cruisers, both traditional emblems of aid organizations. All of these actions clearly positioned humanitarians on the side of the coalition forces, and most of us here in the West accepted that, especially in the weeks after the attacks on September 11th, when we were more inclined to believe Bush's "with us" or "with the terrorists" rhetoric. But that idea puts aid workers in danger, because they must not be perceived as being on anyone's side. One MSFer put it to me this way: we have to develop the capacity to go to the Afghans, whether they're ex-Taliban or whatever, and say, we are not allies of the Americans. We're not even trying to rebuild this country. We're just trying to keep people alive and alleviate suffering while you and the Americans sort this out. At a fundamental level, we don't care whether bin Laden or George Bush is in charge here. It's none of our business. There's no guarantee, of course, that the 5 MSFers who were murdered in Afghanistan by the Taliban last June would have been spared had the U.S. acted more responsibly. Certainly the Taliban are not known for their respect for humanitarian principles. But there's no question that when aid groups become partners of the military, they can no longer demand the immunity that they would be afforded as neutral, independent actors in the field. The situation in Iraq is perhaps even worse than in Afghanistan. In 2003, both the UN and the Red Cross offices were targeted by suicide bombers, and many aid workers have been killed, such as Margaret Hassan of CARE International. Many in the aid community believe that these organizations were targeted because they are seen as tools of the US-led occupying army. Now, that might be putting too fine a point on it. In Iraq, as in Afghanistan, minority groups who once held power but have since lost it, such as the Sunnis in Iraq or the Taliban in Afghanistan, obviously benefit from stirring up instability and fear, and there's no better way to do that than to attack international organizations. However, the behavior of aid organizations at the beginning of the Iraq War was problematic, and it was quite different from what happened in Afghanistan. After September 11th, there wasn't much resistance to the U.S. attacks on Afghanistan, which most people in the West felt were justified. Iraq, of course, was far more polarized. On one hand, Some American aid agencies were happily accepting development contracts from the U.S. government, which MSF and others criticized as a clear conflict of interest. Effectively, they became subcontractors to a belligerent party in the conflict. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you had European aid organizations under pressure from the public in France and Europe in general, pressuring aid organizations to publicly speak out against the impending war. And they actively opposed a military strike on Iraq. But once again, even though it's hard to argue with peace, it is not for humanitarian organizations to advocate for specific political solutions if they are to remain neutral. They can take an active role in the debate, certainly, but that role must be confined to raising awareness, holding governments accountable to their responsibilities, and to providing aid where it is needed. MSF was born out of a fundamental disagreement with the Red Cross, but it has never denounced neutrality. No, they don't remain silent when they witness flagrant breaches of humanitarian principles, and in fact, on the contrary, they're one of the most outspoken of all aid agencies. But they do not and cannot take sides in a conflict without putting their teams in peril in the field. Now, I realize that a lot of what I've talked about tonight seems rather abstract, or at least far removed from our own daily lives. After all, we can't control how governments behave. But we can work to understand how we, as donors to aid agencies, can play a role in the blurring of military and humanitarian interventions. For example, when MSF spoke out against the U.S. military's use of food drops in Afghanistan, they were inundated with angry calls and letters, and they lost many donors. And here in Canada, too, many people criticized MSF for speaking out against the good guys in the war on terrorism. As donors, we need to resist this. We need to see humanitarian aid workers not as people who are on our side during a conflict, but as neutral providers of aid to those who need it. Because if we see them as taking sides, we put them in danger. And when that danger becomes too great, the agencies pull out. MSF, for example, was forced to pull out of both Iraq and Afghanistan last year because of the increasing insecurity in those two countries. And as a result, thousands of people who would have benefited from their medical expertise have had to seek help elsewhere, and they're not always able to find it. We all have a role to play in ensuring that someday independent humanitarian aid will be allowed to operate freely in these countries, and that it can continue to accomplish the goal for which it was created, ending suffering and saving lives. Thanks very much. Did you want to use this microphone now? Yeah, did everyone hear the question? The question was who initiates the calls for humanitarian aid, and what would have been the situation if someone like Hitler, for example, had? I mean, I don't know the whole history of the Red Cross's behavior in World War II, but I do know that they did have access to the Nazi death camps, and they did act as intermediaries, and that's how they knew what was going on. Whether or not they were specifically invited, they certainly weren't specifically invited to provide care to Nazi soldiers, as far as I'm concerned. And for the most part, armies, government forces have their own medical capabilities and don't usually involve the Red Cross, who are more involved in treating civilians. But, that's an interesting question. I don't think that the Red Cross would have been involved, or any other aid organization for that matter, would be involved in providing care to armies like that. However, to answer your question more generally, who initiates or who invites aid organizations, it's important to recognize that aid organizations are almost always invited by national governments to come into their country. They will go in and do an independent assessment when they arrive, but they very often rely on being invited by host governments. And in fact, the vast majority of projects that MSF does in the field are done in close partnership with the local health ministries. So even though they have this reputation of sort of ignoring political boundaries and going wherever the need is, which is true to some extent, it oversimplifies things. And the vast majority of them are really quite conventional projects that are set up with the full cooperation of the governments in the countries in which they work. And those few exceptions where they will go clandestinely into a country are very rare, and it's usually more of a case of if they want to work in South Sudan, they might ignore the Khartoum government's requirement for getting a visa or something like that. It's not quite the gate-crashing rebelliousness that they sometimes have the reputation of having. How long do doctors remain in the field? It varies. A typical project is 6 to 9 months. For people like surgeons, for example, who are involved in trauma surgery, which can be incredibly challenging, and the burnout factor is very high, they might only stay 3 months. In a more low-key project, they may stay as long as a year. But for doctors especially, it's typically hard for them to stay away from their own practices for more than 6 or 9 months, unless they're the type of physicians who want to make humanitarian aid part of their career, and they've worked it in, over the course of many years. They'll do several field projects, but that's harder and harder to do. I mean, MSF pays like $1,000 a month or something like that for their most experienced doctors, and so it's very difficult for them to do it for any length of time. But some do. I met people who have done a dozen missions in the field with MSF over the course of a decade. So there certainly are people who stick it out for the long haul.
You said that it's important for humanitarian organizations to hold governments responsible or call governments for what they need to do for their people. But you said that it was also important for them to remain neutral. Do you think it's a humanitarian organization can effectively call government to action while remaining neutral? If you do think there's just an example of when this is happening.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. How do you walk the line between holding governments responsible and accountable to their actions and yet at the same time remaining neutral? But yeah, it is possible. I would say a good example of that would be, for example, the situation in Chechnya. MSF for a long time has spoken out against the Russian government and have said, you are responsible for upholding international humanitarian law. You are responsible for looking after civilians in the area. You are not, you can't bomb hospitals. You can't attack aid agencies. I mean, in some cases, the Russian government has even been accused, although not proven, to have been involved in the abduction of a number of aid workers, because the Russian government obviously doesn't want a whole bunch of international aid workers in Chechnya who can witness what's going on there. That's not the same, in other words, a humanitarian organization that upholds the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law and insists that governments follow those responsibilities, that's not an act of, that's not taking a side. They're not saying you must, withdraw your troops from this country and you must engage in diplomatic talks with this government. You must do the following things. They don't necessarily advocate specific things other than pointing out their responsibilities under international humanitarian law, which unfortunately is something that does exist on paper but is not always followed in practice. But, I mean, for example, the U.S. criticized, MSF criticized the U.S. food drops in Afghanistan and their close relationship with aid organizations in Iraq. But that's not the same thing as saying they shouldn't have bombed Afghanistan or they shouldn't have invaded Iraq. That would have been compromising their neutrality. So you can hold governments to their responsibilities without actually telling them what to do politically and militarily. Okay, good question about MSF. MSF does have a Toronto office. Just give you the real quick background about MSF as an organization. It is a European-based organization. It has 5 different, what they call operational sections, 5 sections in France, Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, and Spain that control all of their medical projects all over the world. But then in 13 other countries around the world, including Canada, they have satellite offices, or partner sections as they call them, and those are responsible for fundraising, for recruiting volunteers, and for raising awareness in their home countries. MSF Canada, for example, does not run any of its own medical projects. It is a partner of MSF Holland, and the United States is a partner with MSF France, for example. If you're interested in learning more about MSF or about making a donation, you can visit their website. msf.ca is the Canadian one, or msf.org is their international website, which is a bigger resource and has information on their activities in all the countries where they're working right now.
Yes, sir. One of the most flagrant breaches of the Geneva Convention that's been going on now for 28 years is the case with the Israeli treatment of Palestinians. Cristiano, who was with MSF for many years, worked in the Palestinian camps in Lebanon.
I think he was with the Red Cross, though, was he not?
I think he's now with the Red Cross.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. They are active in the Palestinian Authority, and they are providing aid there. But again, that's one of those places where it's very, very difficult to come out and make a statement about, the Israeli government's behavior there. And they did at one point, just a few months ago, there was a bit of a brouhaha in MSF Canada because they had made some claim to the fact, and I don't want to get into detail because I can't remember all of the specifics and I don't want to get myself into trouble, but they did make some comment having to do with Israel's failure to abide by UN resolution, and they got inundated with letters from people again, as you always do when you take a stand on whatever side of that conflict. So it's very difficult for them, and I think they try not to get involved in controversies like that, and it's easier for them just to simply say, we will go into the Palestinian Authority and we will provide aid for people there, regardless of the political situation. We're not going to start saying, we're not going to come up with a Mideast peace plan, right? I mean, that's of providing aid. But, that is a conflict, for example, that if MSF is going to go into that area and provide aid, it's not going to be providing aid to the Israeli army, right? Because that's not where the needs are. So there are times, and this is the distinction between impartiality and neutrality. You have to provide aid in proportion to the need. And so there are very often conflicts where one side is far more in need of humanitarian assistance than the other. So if you're working only in one side, sometimes you can be perceived as, compromising your neutrality. In a lot of places where MSF works, like in Africa, for example, where there are, numerous civil wars going on, both sides need help, and MSF does a really good job of sending teams onto both sides and at least opening up a dialogue with both sides. So there's an understanding. We're not here because, we're on your side of the war. We're here because you've got a lot of people suffering and in need of our aid. In Israel, I think the situation is a little bit different. But, their reputation internationally and with governments is strong enough that it hasn't really gotten them into trouble with governments. It's more gotten them into trouble with donors who don't always understand the positions that they take.
One of the things that's happened in the last few years has been that we've grown to understand the trauma of the observer who's placed in difficult situations like that. I wonder if you could comment on the kinds of traumas and difficulties that doctors experience and nurses when they come back from places where they were placed in that role, and what kind of What kind of supports are given to them from MSF? Yeah, that's a good question. The question is about the situation that doctors find themselves in, or nurses, when they come back after having witnessed, in many cases, very traumatic events. I would say, I devoted about half a chapter to this in the book, because I found it one of the most interesting things of the aid workers I talked to was just how difficult it is for them to come back to the West and to reintegrate into society. I think that part of it has to do with you prepare yourself, mentally, to go into a place where you're going to witness suffering. And as a doctor, you're used to seeing death. You're used to seeing suffering, and so you build up a certain wall. Not necessarily used to seeing what you actually do see if you were to go to one of the, an area like Chechnya or the Congo. But I think for the most part, doctors are pretty good about holding up in the field. The most difficult part comes when they come back. And, they will come back after having spent 9 months in a place like Sierra Leone or Ivory Coast. And you come back here and, people say, so how was the trip? And, you start to talk. And people listen for about a minute, and then they have no idea what you're talking about. I had people tell me that they'd spend a year in Liberia, and they'd come back, and people go, "Isn't it cold there?" And you go, "No, that's Siberia," right? And it sounds funny, but people have no idea where you are. They have no idea that there's even a war there. And, you've just spent the better part of a year watching people die. And it's very difficult to come back to an environment where no one understands that. Because when you're in the field, of course, everybody is in it together. And you have a real, common goal. And you've got a small team. And even though these people, it's really interesting, the team dynamics in MSF. I can remember one night in Afghanistan, we were sitting around playing a game of Uno, the card game. And, there was 6 of us. We had a guy from Sweden, an Afghan doctor, 2 Canadians, a German, and an Austrian, all sitting around the table playing this card game. And it's like a UN convention, You get to meet people from all over the world, and yet you're united in the fact that you all care very deeply about the situation that you're in, and you're working hard together to put together a project to serve these people. And then you come back and people ask you questions. How much do they pay you anyway? And it's very difficult to relate. And you ask what supports are there. MSF does offer supports. They have what's called a peer support network. And what it is experienced volunteers who have spent many years in the field. And they make themselves available for phone conferences before and after volunteers leave, especially on first missions. And, people will take advantage of that. And some people say, yeah, it's helpful, I guess, probably especially for a first-timer. But, it's really difficult still to talk to someone on the phone a couple of 100 miles away and get the support you need. And what happens with a lot of them is that there's a pattern that they just go back to the field because that's the only place they feel comfortable. And that's the only place that they feel people understand them. And what happens is after 10 or 12 years of doing that, you've suppressed an awful lot of emotion, and some people burn out or break down. And, a big part, I think, of it is you have to recognize when you've spent too much time in the field and it's time to come back and take an office job, fundraising or something. But to be, sorry, some job that's useless, that doesn't have any, no trauma involved. That was a poor choice of words. Yeah, he's not coming back. So the one place, and I'm doing my best to get away from this topic. The one place that I did hear some criticism of MSF was that they do tend to push people back in the field because their needs are so great. right? And as a doctor or nurse, you come back and you're just feeling acclimatized again, and the phone rings and they say, "We need you." And are you ready to go back out in the field? We really need someone like you because you're so experienced. And they put the screws to you, and you end up going again. And I did talk to people who said part of living this lifestyle is knowing when to say, you know what, I need 6 months or I need a year to recuperate, and I need to spend some time with my friends and my family and my normal life because I need to be fresh when I go back out in the field. There's one thing I think is interesting about MSF is that they have made it a requirement that about 1/3 of all their volunteers in the field need to be first-timers. So on one hand, you have a fair number of inexperienced people going into the field, but what they do retain is that shock value of, the first time, you walk into a hospital in the Congo and you're shocked at the conditions that are there. That is a real powerful motivator. And, the 15th time you've done it, it's just not quite as poignant. And so they have made an effort, as a sort of safeguard against their own complacency, to make sure that a third or so of their first-timers have that initial shock. It's a powerful force to have on your side.
Yes?
Hi. I want to thank you for your presentation. It was really thorough and articulate, I think, for the position. I'm still trying to figure out how much of it I did.
Okay.
What I want to ask you about is whether aid can ever be political. Is aid always political in the sense that you're choosing political? Like, I preface my question with how forward you are testing the incentives that they all like your example of the reward situation where MSF makes sure to put people on both sides. But often a lot of development aid chooses where it's political. So like you said about the housing in the States. It's a political act just to choose to go in there. And you're not so suddenly decide you're supporting just by choosing to go there.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'm trying to understand the distinction you're making between what we call non-partiality and partiality and neutrality. I don't see it ever being neutral.
No, that's an excellent question, and I mean, you're right. I suppose in some ways, I certainly heard from people in the field, that they acknowledge that, aid, it exists in an ugly reality, right? It doesn't exist in a vacuum, and so the waters that you're swimming in are always muddied with these kind of ethical questions. But to answer your question, the first thing I think we need to do is make a distinction between development aid and humanitarian aid. Okay? Development aid, and what I'm talking about, this is, the many organizations that dig wells and bring shovels and seeds to help people plant, building schools and things like that. These are all very worthy products, but they're not humanitarian aid. Okay? Humanitarian aid is confined, especially in we're talking about MSF specifically, humanitarian medical aid, okay, is confined to providing medical care and saving lives, okay, which could also include feeding as well. So MSF, for example, has nutritional programs where it feeds under fives children. Other organizations have a wider mandate, and they will do what they call blanket feeding programs, like the UN's World Food Program is the best example of that, where they will provide food for an entire population. So what I'm getting at is then humanitarian medical aid can be distributed in a neutral way, because you do epidemiological surveys, you figure out mortality rates. If they're below a certain threshold, you provide aid there. If they're not below a certain threshold, you don't. That's not a political act, okay? That's neutral.
And that's what I mean about impartiality. The principle of impartiality is that you provide aid in proportion to the need, okay? So if you go into an area where there are two armies fighting and one of them was plainly victorious and they've left, a wake of destruction, and you provide aid only to those people, that's still an impartial act. It might appear neutral, or not neutral, because it might look like you're helping one side and not the other, but you're helping one side and not the other because only one side needs help. And so MSF has been very good. They're a funny sort of paradox that they're this incredibly passionate organization that is known for its brashness and for its speaking out. But, on one level, too, they're extremely good technically, and they have developed a real expertise in epidemiology. And they can go into an area and come up with, a very technical report on measles morbidity and cholera, mortality rates, and they can provide that to an organization, a funding organization like the UN, and say, this is the situation in such and such a place, this is the program we would like to set up, we will serve X number of people, we need this many staff, we need this much money, can we get the funding? And so I think it is possible to do aid like that in a neutral way. If you're talking about more sort of long-term development projects, and then you get into, funding governments to help them, with employment programs and things like that, that is inherently political and much more difficult. But that is not humanitarian either. Again, it's still worthy. I don't mean to, in any way, to dismiss development aid, but it's not the same as humanitarian aid, and it operates under different principles. I hope that helps. MSF is involved in a number of vaccination programs, very often in refugee camps. Actually, the number one priority in a refugee camp when it's set up is measles vaccination. Measles is one of the biggest killers of people in refugee camps, especially children, and so that's a big part of their work. But as an emergency relief organization, they're not involved in the larger blanket vaccination programs, which are more the domain of, say, someone like UNICEF, who works in partnership with the health ministries and provides long-term funding for them. MSF has tried, as an emergency relief organization and not a development aid group, to try to go into an area with a very specific need, bring people back up to a certain level of functioning, and then get out. They don't like to be in places for years and years and years. In some cases and in some places they have been, because the needs have never normalized. But unlike someone like UNICEF, who has this, decades-long commitment to vaccinations and programs like that, MSF doesn't get involved in that kind of activity. This project actually originated with the publisher of the book, Firefly Books, and they came to me and asked me to do it. And I was really intrigued by it because I think, like a lot of people, I had heard of Médecins Sans Frontières. I thought I knew what they were about. And I also thought, I wondered why this organization, I think more so than many other aid organizations, has really managed to capture the imagination of the public. They have a real reputation, I think, in the general public. The Nobel Prize certainly helps. But they also have this reputation, as I had said, this idea of this scrappy group that trumped Red Cross neutrality. And as I started to do more and more reading and talk to people, I realized a lot of the stuff that I thought I believed about this organization were in fact not true. And, I think like a lot of people, I labored under some misconceptions about what humanitarian aid workers were like. They were all a bunch of angelic do-gooders, and I thought I knew what their motivations would be. And when I started talking to them, and I devoted a whole chapter in the book on the motivations of people, why they do this kind of work, and it was not what I expected. I mean, there's a whole constellation of reasons why people do this work, and even within the same person, their motivation for doing that first project was quite different from the motivation for doing their 7th or 8th one, because almost all of them go into the field the first time and come back disillusioned. And they think, this is not what I expected it to be. And yet, I cannot recall meeting anyone who said, I went into the field, this wasn't what I expected it to be, and I never went again, and I never will. It was always, wow, this, I thought we would go in and we would be saving thousands of lives, and we go in and I ended up in this, little health clinic in Ethiopia, treating people who had snake bites. And, it wasn't at all what I expected, and it was so bureaucratic, and I'm going on another mission in 2 weeks. So I was fascinated by that, what drew them back to this kind of work. And, there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But, one that you keep coming back to is that even though people recognize that a group like MSF or any other humanitarian aid group is not going to change the world, it can change the world for some people. And the other thing that is really a big part of the story is that, these volunteers go into places and they work with medical volunteers, from the countries where they're working, right? The national staff, they call them. And the medical team might only have 2 or 3 international volunteers, and all the rest will be local staff. And when you work with these people and you see in many cases how well trained they are, how dedicated they are, even though many of them are not getting paid, okay? And you form genuine relationships and friendships with these people, and you can't leave them. And the hardest thing for an aid worker to do is to have to evacuate a program. And I talked to a number of people who had to do it for security reasons. And you cannot bring those people with you. I mean, Rwanda is the most heartbreaking example of that. And there are stories in the book of, people having to leave trucks full of their colleagues at the border as they escaped into Burundi, and they knew that those people were going to be killed within days, and many of them were. And in other cases, they're not quite that dramatic, but it's very difficult for a doctor to go into a place and work with these people for 6 months and then just go home. What keeps them coming back is the commitment to the local medical staff and to the patients, of course. Yeah, absolutely. That, getting back to what I was saying about what surprised me about the organization, I mean, I think like a lot of people, I thought it was an organization of doctors, but in fact, doctors are only about a quarter of their volunteers. 40% are non-medical. So they do absolutely take volunteers as administrators, financial coordinators, logisticians, who are the people in charge of organizing all the logistics, which I devote some time in the book to these guys because they're a real fascinating group. These are people who come from all walks of life. They're, firefighters, they're overland tour operators, lawyers, all kinds of people who just for whatever reason decided they want to get into humanitarian aid. And these guys are dropped into a place. I mean, I can remember in Kandahar in Afghanistan where I visited, the logistician there was a Canadian guy. And, he had been a scuba instructor and had all these sort of eclectic jobs. And the things he had to do, he had to rewire this house, he had to find a guy to open a safe that had locked all their money in, he had to, hire people to go to the bazaar to buy clothing for the women because they weren't allowed to go themselves. And I mean, the job description is insane. And as he described it as, what did he say, a list that, you spend the whole day working through, and at the end you feel like you got nothing done. And absolutely, they do use a lot of people who don't have necessarily any medical expertise. Very important part of the teams. Well, certainly the lines are already blurred. Whether or not we can backtrack, I'm not sure. I should point out, though, that I think the issue is less pressing in a natural disaster. The Canadians, for example, the DART team that's in Sri Lanka now, there was just a thing on CBC the other day where they were talking with some people from Oxfam who were working there as well and saying, we're not all that comfortable working rubbing shoulders with the Army here. But I think it's less of an issue when you're talking about natural disaster because, I mean, the Canadian Army is not in the humanitarian aid business, but at the same time, the needs in that country are so great, and I don't think that the Canadian Army can be perceived as in any way a belligerent party in Sri Lanka. I mean, they pose no threat to anyone. They're there only providing. There was a time not so long ago where the Canadian Army actually did pose a threat, but it's been becoming increasingly unlikely. But in any case, what I mean is, as you know, they're not there providing only care for the Sinhalese or only care for the Tamils, right? They're there. In fact, I think what's more of a problem is in places like Indonesia, where the Indonesian army has said, thanks for the aid, we'll take it from here, and they unload the planes and they put it in the back of their trucks and it never gets to the people who need it. That's a much bigger problem. So again, I would make the distinction between neutrality during an obvious conflict and neutrality during a natural disaster where there are no belligerent parties. It's much less of a concern. Although, as I said, Oxfam did express some concern about it. So, people in the field may feel differently than I do. We'll wrap it up. Okay.
I know many of you who are here tonight are people who regularly attend our Center for the Catholic Experience lectures. And this room has seen many, many occasions when casual assumptions and unconsidered thoughts have been challenged and sharpened by the information that people have brought. And I think that tonight we have had such an occasion. And I would like you to join me in thanking Dan for bringing his knowledge and expertise. I have a couple of people I would like to thank before I bid you good night. The first is Sarah Daly, who is almost wholly responsible for the organization of this evening. She did a wonderful job and was given great assistance by my other assistant, Rhonda Flewelling. I'd like to thank our president, Michael Higgins, who oversaw the whole thing as well. And the people who
provided all of the service, the facility staff and the students, the people who do all the setup, the invisible folks, many of whom are here tonight attending, all of our donors once again, all of you for coming out. Thank you so much. Just a reminder that Dan's book is for sale at the back from Wordsworth Book. He also has a couple of other books. These are books for children, but they're about rescues of extinct animals, panda rescue, tiger rescue. These are wonderful books with a social justice theme as well. Thank you very much for coming. Good night.